Good evening, everybody. We have 15 minutes each, so I have to focus my remarks on something very specific. But in the spirit of forgiveness, I suppose we should all start by acknowledging that governing in a modern democracy is not easy. Governments are elected by an increasingly fragmented and diverse electorate to pursue a host of contradictory goals. And on top of all that, national governments now don't have as much power as they like to think they have, and I'm afraid as we like to think they have. So, having said all that, we can, I suppose, give them that disagreement and conflict is inevitable about how they go about fulfilling any mandate. But that's the job. And to find ways to, the only way to do that from any studies of leadership in any domain is they have to find ways to successfully harness cooperation. That's the essential of leadership. They have to manage conflict. They have to keep people hopeful and focused on a common purpose that seems worthwhile and that might be good not just for us but for the generations to come. And as one of the best studies of leadership puts it, they have to encourage the heart of those they lead. So if you take those as the basics of how any leader or government should go about any kind of change, then the introduction of voter charges, I think, could be fairly described as a fairly spectacular case study in a failure to do any of those things. I mean, I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to, I leave it to my, if not my elders, certainly my betters, to look at the political and administrative and governance mistakes that were made. But as a psychologist, I think I could be forgiven to say that there was a certain lack of emotional intelligence on display about how they went about the job. Not least understanding the psychology of recovery. During the worst years of the financial crisis and the bailout, Irish people responded in classic survival mode to the existential threat, actually, that there was to the country and that there was to our own futures and the future of our children. And we absorbed loss after loss after loss. And I think most people focused on trying to hold things together. If there was a national strategy at individual level, that was it. And I think they did this not just effectively, but I think actually in comparison to other countries, I think they did it fairly heroically. And one of the things that struck me about the election was the graceless lack of appreciation that was actually expressed to the electorate. There was a kind of a clunky poster at the beginning about, it worked because you worked or something like that, but it disappeared fairly fast. But I certainly, the campaign was certainly not notable for a kind of a full-bodied sense of appreciation about what people had done. I think it would actually have made a big difference. But by 2015, the ground had sort of stopped moving under us, at least. And as the Eurobarometer survey in November 2015 showed, most Irish people felt something akin to stability. They were, more than half were hopeful about the future and felt that their own future, not just the country's future, was on an upward trajectory. Now, there probably isn't a person in this room who hasn't gone through a health crisis, either their own or some member of their family at some point or other. And everybody knows that once the worst of the crisis is over, people are still in a very vulnerable state. And when you're in that vulnerable state and you're sort of out of the emergency ward and you're in rehab, as it were, you cling tightly to what you now really hope is the status quo. In other words, you think like, I've got as far as here and the worst is over. And they want only to see that the status quo is going to remain like that. And during that early recovery period, when resources are still very depleted all around, any setback, however minor, assumes huge potential for threat. Rationally, this new setback might be nothing in comparison to what you've just gone through or someone in your family has just gone through, but somehow it's the sort of the straw that breaks people. The reaction is not rational. The reaction is very emotional and it's usually very negative. And that's why during early recovery periods, anyone with a modicum of emotional intelligence knows that the issue is to keep the environment as stable as long as possible. And if you have to introduce any change which involves a new loss, however minor, you have to do it very carefully and with great consideration and with a lot of sensitivity. And I don't think any of those were much on display either. So I want to focus, having said that, on just one aspect of the water charges issue, and that is the continuing uncertainty about what's going to happen to those 64% of Irish people who've already paid their water charges. And of course also people from rural areas who've been paying water charges since, they were knee-high to a donkey without much complaint. And as I understand it, and I'll be corrected, I'm sure if I'm wrong, the position of Fine Gael, Labour and some of the independents is that in the event of water charges being abolished, those who paid should be refunded. The Fianna Fáil position is that those who paid should not be refunded, but that those who did not pay should be pursued. Sinn Féin is opposed to any refunds to those who paid. And in one radio interview that I heard with one of the leading anti-water campaigners, he said that those who paid, when he was asked, he said those who paid should have known better than to pay when they saw the thousands of people protesting on the street. So it was a fairly clear message that if you were stupid enough to pay your water charges, then don't be stupid enough to think that you're going to get them back. Now, this political wrangling about whether or not the water charges should be refunded is not a minor policy matter, and it's not an administrative detail to be tidied up. I think it has serious implications for politics, and I think it poses a substantial risk to the social contract, which is the fundamental basis for government, law and a functioning republic. Because this period of uncertainty is going to go on for a long time, until the Commission comes up with their recommendation, and even then there's probably going to be further debate, wrangling, etc. So it could be many, many, many months. And this period of uncertainty is not dead time. In other words, we're not all suspending, as it were, our common sense or our judgment about what's happening, but this uncertainty is an active force that I think is going to seriously affect our understanding of the social contract. Trust underpins the social contract. It works on the basis that people consent to be governed, to pay their taxes and to obey the law because they trust that the government will use the collective resources to build the common good, which in turn will benefit them. So that's how social contract works. But it also works on the trust that the government will ensure that everybody else in society also follows the same rules and makes their fair contribution. If that does not happen and equity doesn't prevail in the case of the water charges, I think it will further damage trust in a country that's already dealing, I think, with a severe crisis of trust in politics. I referred earlier to the Eurobarometer survey in November 2015. Since 1973, as you probably all know, the European Commission carries out this twice-yearly survey of EU countries on a variety of issues, including public trust. And the last survey, which came out just before the election, showed that the Irish people's trust in political institutions in particular, that's the Dáil, the government and the political parties, is at an all-time low. And political parties came out the very worst. 81% of Irish people say they distrust political parties. That's a fairly astonishing figure. Now, compared to other EU countries, the Irish have a long tradition of distrust in politics, and that's been much further eroded since the onset of the financial crisis. And this distrust is also accompanied, according to the survey, by a general indifference about politics. A third of adults report that they never discuss national politics, and only 20% discuss them regularly, or even discuss local politics. And of course, distrust and indifference feed on each other and produce a negative downward spiral. If there's a general feeling of trust in a society, then indifference is a very different force. You're kind of indifferent because you think they're looking after the shop, and you're not going to be using up your one and only life worried about the detail of policy. But the very minute it looks like they're not managing the shop, you get people interested again. That's how it works when there's a kind of a high trust thing. But when there's a low trust thing, the more you think they're not managing, the more removed you get, the more you remove yourself from it. And so you get a very dangerous vacuum because people become less and less informed about what's going on. And so you're very susceptible then to populism and the siren call, as it were. And then we had the election on top of that, and it was one of the most cheerless, visionless elections that I remember for a while. You had all the political wrangling and posturing during that very long-term, long drawn-out process of government formation, and now the continuing uncertainty and manoeuvring about Irish water. So I think it's likely, if we surveyed the Irish populace again now, that the distrust on show in November 2015 would be in a much worse state. So I want to just look at the psychology of the social contract, if you'll bear with me. When any group of people get together to organise their lives collectively, in a family, in a community of interest, or in a whole society, the first and most basic issue they have to resolve is how to find ways to cooperate with each other. They have to agree what contribution is required from each member of the family, or each member of the sporting organisation, or each member of the business, or whatever, so that the group will work. And that contribution, whether it's time or money or other resources, inevitably involves a sacrifice with no immediate benefit to yourself, but it's made on the assumption that if you do your bit and everybody does their bit, that the benefit will be for the whole group and eventually for each individual. And I'm going to describe a series of classic psychological experiments by behavioural economists that tried to replicate in a laboratory how this process of making a social contract works and what destroys it. And the results were very revealing. And these particular experiments have been repeated over and over again in different circumstances, so their findings are very robust. And what lessons we might draw from the findings. So what happens is groups of people are brought together, and there are multiple groups, okay? And in each group, everybody is given a certain amount of money. And in each round of the experiment, they can either keep the money for themselves or they can put it into a communal pot. And then when the communal pot is it's all done anonymously. When the communal pot is counted up, then the experimenter doubles whatever is in it and then redistributes it. So there is a built-in incentive, for people to cooperate. So it's not perfect, but it's a reasonably good analogy of how it works in a society. But of course, it's much more complex in a societal level. But to benefit, everybody has to contribute. So the whole process depends on trust and cooperation. In any group of people, and we know this from multiple experiments, most people actually are disposed or willing to cooperate until they have evidence to the contrary that they shouldn't. And in fact, there is some evidence that the human brain is wired not just to compete, but actually to cooperate as well, because there's a huge survival advantage to that. But in any group, we also know that there's also a sizable minority of people who will only cooperate or trust as long as they are assured that other people are also going to contribute. And there are always some who will try to get away with it. That's how it is in any group. So in the first round of this experiment, across all these multiple groups, the vast majority of people did actually contribute quite generously. The average contribution into the communal pot was between 40 and 60% of the money that each person had at their disposal. And people made their contributions anonymously, but of course, as soon as the pot was counted up, it became obvious that some people had contributed very little or some not at all. And then, after a few rounds, the experimenter divided all the groups into two categories. And one set of groups were given the option that in further rounds of this, as they contributed, they could sanction or punish people by fining them if they didn't contribute. They wouldn't know who they are, but the experimenter would. And in the other groups, they weren't given that option at all. So they had to keep, as it were, making a decision about contributing. In the groups where people were not given the option to sanction the people who were as not contributing, the contributions went down very dramatically and very quickly. And by the last round, a full 3/4 of the group were contributing nothing, and the remaining quarter next to nothing. So it was a classic demonstration of what happens if you don't have sanctions for people who don't contribute, as it were, to the common good. Effectively, group cooperation had collapsed. Now, in contrast, look at what happened in the groups where people were given the option that you could, as it were, sanction or punish people or fine people if they didn't actually, as it were, contribute like everybody else. And what happened, and of course people did it very willingly and very fast. And what happened is, in the next round of the game, everybody contributed more. Everybody. The people who had never contributed, contributed. The people who had contributed a small amount contributed an awful lot more, up to 60% more. And those even who had always contributed, contributed more again. Because what that had given them is the assurance that they could trust that if they were being generous and paying their dues, as it were, to the common pot, then, as it were, they had the option of making sure that other people, as it were, didn't get away with it. So when the group at one point were actually then given another option, which is that they could actually have a discussion and agree amongst themselves what would be a kind of a reasonable contribution. What then happened is that people contributed even more again. And by the end of the system, they were contributing almost 100% of their money into the communal pot. Now, you can see how, if that money was doubled and all redistributed back, everybody was going to benefit from it. And that level of cooperation stayed high and stayed stable. So there are two lessons to be learned, I think, about human behaviour from those experiments. First, people are willing to cooperate in a social contract, and they can achieve very high, stable, altruistic cooperation. So it's not a silly, idealistic thing to think that you can have a society where people willingly contribute and pay their taxes because they believe that it will build the common good, the public good, which in turn will benefit everybody. But they'll only do it if they believe they're operating in a fair system. That's the absolute criterion for getting this kind of societal cooperation. And the more they're engaged in constructing the rules of fairness, the more cooperative they become. The second lesson is that people will not passively accept a situation where others are not cooperating or are contributing very little, while continuing to reap the benefits. Unfairness rankles very deeply with people. Nobody wants to be a sucker. In these experiments, when people were asked how they feel about those who refused to cooperate, the so-called free riders, they expressed very strong anger. In fact, on a scale that you could express up to 7 in terms of how annoyed you were, the average score was 6. Understandably, those who contribute a lot were the angriest, but even those who had contributed very little got angry, because nobody likes to think that some other people are getting a free ride on their cooperation and contribution. So I think politicians would be wise to carefully consider these two basic lessons about human nature. Fairness and sanctions are key to securing high levels of cooperation. And I think it unlikely that the 65% of Irish people who paid their charges will passively accept being treated unfairly. And like the people in the experiments, I think they're likely to react angrily. As they see it, they obeyed the law, they paid their water charges, and amongst them, I'm certain, a large section of the people who disagreed maybe with the principle of water charges or were dismayed by how inept the whole process was. So whatever the future of water charges, they'll expect justice and fairness with regard to the legacy issues of payment. And if that does not happen, the consequences for public trust, I think, will be serious. And I think the concern is that by the time even those decisions are taken, whatever they are, the continuing uncertainty, I think, will erode bit by bit, day by day. So we're not going to be in the same state of mind even when the decision is finally taken that we are now. This is not empty time while we wait to be told our fate. Reviewing all the research like this and other research, Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work, he cautioned people to be very careful about imposing losses on others that are perceived to be unfair, particularly if the victims are in a position to retaliate. And of course, voters are. And he points out something interesting. He points out that even people who themselves have incurred no losses, but who witness what they regard as unfair behaviour, will often join in the punishment. So I think Irish politicians would be unwise to expect that even those who didn't pay their water charges and who got away with it will be rushing to support them in any way. One further finding from all this research is that people are more than willing to sanction those who do not cooperate in a group, even when it brings no personal gain. So, even if it costs something, they're still willing to do it. So if they're not doing it for personal gain, why are people so interested in sanctioning unfairness? And the motivation appears to be altruistic. The motivation is to protect other people against the unfairness that can not just hurt those other people, but can actually undermine the build-up of trust in a group of any kind. And the way the human brain works actually helps to maintain that motivation. If you look at MRIs of people who are engaged in dealing out punishment and sanctions to those who behave unfairly, what you find is a lot of activity in the part of the brain that registers pleasure. So, in other words, we like doing it, you know. So it appears that maintaining social order and the rules of fairness is wired deeply into our brain so that it becomes its own reward. People are motivated to create good societies for all kinds of good and positive and idealistic reasons. But to quote Daniel Kahneman, altruistic punishment could be the glue that holds societies together. So one final remark. I was engaged myself for 17 years in this much maligned social partnership process. And of course, I'm more than conscious from being at the centre of all that for so long that it did become very flabby and overextended. And I think at one point I counted 80 working groups, because Irish politicians are kind of addicted, you know, to setting up new institutions, new bodies every time something comes up. And partly it's because they like, you know, opening things, you know, and partly I think in a more cynical moment I might say that they like distributing the power around to so many people that actually none of us has power in the end. But there was an awful lot of silly stuff written when in 2009, 2010, you know, in the teeth of the crisis about, you know, how pathetic and useless and, you know, these so-called quangos were. But in fact, I believe that for all their flaws, that if the water charges process had been put through the sausage machine of social partnership in a preliminary way and had been looked at by the unions, who are no daws, as it were, when it comes to predicting how people are going to react, and the huge number of people who are involved in civic society, which is an extraordinarily vibrant aspect of Irish life, and the sensible politicians who were there, and of course the top officials who kept us all sort of on the straight and narrow. I doubt really that it would have ever seen the light of day in the way that it did. I think it would have been a more considered introduction when it was there. So maybe it's time for us all to reinvent some new kind of social partnership, because I don't think we could really be doing much worse than we're doing. Thank you very much.